Yes?
Boss, final préparation are complete. We can execute the plan.
Excellent. World politics are steadily progressing towards the desired goal. What about technology?
All set up, and prepared to initiate technological employment we enter phase 2.
Very good. Activate phase 1. Do not fail me.
It is the 21st century. Human technology is advancing at an unprecedented rate, leading to incredible breakthroughs in medicine, artificial intelligence, and global communications. The economy of the United States is flourishing, and yet poverty is still widespread. The disenfranchised masses quarrel amongst themselves, never able to pin the blame on the right perpetrator. Corporations, profiting off this conflict and emerging technologies, now have more power than the government. Now, tell me this. Did I just describe the setting of some bleak cyberpunk novel from the 90s? Or did I just describe the state of the world right here and now in 2019? We all like to think of the future as distant and unknowable, too caught up in our lives to think about what can or will be. But the problem with this notion is that, regardless of whether you acknowledge it or not, time continues to move forward, and at an exponentially faster rate, too. What many people fail to realize is that the future will inevitably turn into the present, and things that were once predictions will become reality. The science fiction genre has always had its fair share of surprisingly accurate predictions, but few components of the genre can claim to have predicted the socio-political environment of the late 2010s with the same amount of precision as the year 2000 video game Deus Ex. This game, coupled with its sequel Deus Ex Human Revolution, portrays a world beset by hyper-capitalist technocracies, where corporations and governments have merged together to conspire against the general populace. While it may seem overwhelmingly dystopian, many of the predictions made by this game series are coming to fruition, and disturbingly quickly at that. Let's start at the very beginning. In Deus Ex, you play as a man named J.C. Denton. Denton works for UNATCO, an anti-terrorist organization created in response to a growing terrorist threat across the world. A terrorist group known as the NSF has been causing trouble, carrying out an attack on the Statue of Liberty, and stealing ambrosia, a medicine used to treat a vicious pathogen known as the Grey Death, which has been hurting large swaths of the American populace. On the surface, it would seem like the NSF have no ulterior motives other than to cause chaos. But during the very first mission of the game, you meet with one of their leaders, and things take a radical turn.
Don't shoot. I surrender.
So you think you know better than FEMA what to do with this month's ambrosia shipment?
You're too late. It's on its way back to the people, and you can't do a damn thing about it.
Tell me about the shipment, and I'll order the troops to pick you up as a prisoner instead of a corpse.
Ask away. We already won this round.
Where are you taking it?
We're just giving ordinary people the same chance to survive as the bureaucrats in Washington.
You'll have to unload in New York because the choppers would spot you at sea.
I think the government made the plague on purpose to get rid of the population growth.
Just answer the question.
Don't believe me? It's all in the numbers. For 100 years, there's been a conspiracy of plutocrats against ordinary people.
Do you have a single fact to back that up?
Number one, in 1945, corporations paid 50% of federal taxes. Now they pay about 5%. Number two, in 1900, 90% of Americans were self-employed. Now it's about 2%.
So?
It's called consolidation. Strengthen governments and corporations, weaken individuals. With taxes, this can be done imperceptibly over time.
This is the first time you realize that not everything is as it appears. The NSF leader certainly makes some bold points, but is anything he says even true? Let's look at the stats. Corporate taxes certainly have been on the downturn as of late, and considering this game takes place during the 2050s, it's reasonable to assume that this trend is going to continue. Self-employment is also declining, though not necessarily at the rate the NSF leader is claiming. However, it is true that the US has one of the lowest self-employment rates in the developed world, especially for the unincorporated self-employed. It's impossible to say exactly what these stats are going to be some 30 or so years from now, But a lot of what the NSF leader is saying has some base in reality. So where does consolidation come into this whole thing? In order to understand why these stats are so important, you have to understand the disturbingly close relationship corporations have with the United States government, which manifests itself in a very simple process. Let's say that there's a wealthy CEO of a large and prosperous corporation. Using his or her financial resources, this CEO is able to influence the government in a variety of ways. They can buy ads or bribe lobbyists in order to put certain people into positions of power within the government. This gives the CEO a considerable amount of leverage over these government officials, allowing them to force said officials to serve the interests of their corporation. If their influence is in Congress, a corporation can create legislation that benefits them financially, usually by removing business regulations. If it's in the Supreme Court, they gain an advantage if they run into any legal trouble. If a corporation manages to get someone elected as president, they effectively become the front face of the entire nation, which gives them enormous influence over the US public. Different groups of people worry equally about the power of big government and big corporate, without realizing that they're virtually the same thing. The reason this merging of the corporate and government sectors is so dangerous is because, unlike the government, corporations have no particular incentive to act in the best interests of the public. And if they're feeding the government with money and influence, neither does the government to a certain extent, since its power is no longer being provided by the people, but by corporate entities. Most of the time, the only interests a corporation is serving is its own, and likewise, they'll do whatever they have to in order to turn a profit. It might sound apocalyptic, but stuff like this has already happened, and is continuing to happen today. Take renewable energy, for instance. The US is a very wealthy nation, and it is completely within our capabilities to replace our aging fossil fuel plants with safer and cleaner alternatives, such as solar, hydroelectric, or nuclear. The only reason we haven't done this yet is because of the influence petrochemical energy companies wield in our government. Using their funds, they convince congressmen to support their businesses by refusing to pass renewable energy legislation, and loosening restrictions on fossil fuel proliferation. This entire process is greatly aided by corporate consolidation, which reduces the competition corporations face when trying to worm their way into the government. Though monopolies might be technically illegal, corporations can still gain massive control over individual sectors of manufacturing and business by purchasing smaller companies and turning them into subsidiaries, thereby gaining control of numerous new properties. What's really insidious about this tactic is that products manufactured by the subsidiaries of a larger corporate entity retain the trademarks of the subsidiaries, so the people buying them think their money is going to the original manufacturer of the product, when in reality it's being funneled up to the corporate overlords of those smaller properties. In Deus Ex, we can see the results of excessive corporate consolidation in action. Since money is now being directed from consumers into the hands of an elite few, poverty is a widespread problem in the world of Deus Ex, even though the economy is technically flourishing thanks to groundbreaking technological developments in cybernetic augmentation and artificial intelligence. Truth is, even if the stock market is booming and corporations are doing great, the people in the bottom tiers of the social pyramid aren't going to be reaping many of those benefits. This is because the wealth created by the American upper class is usually invested in the stock market or stashed away in offshore bank accounts, which means it never filters through the rest of the US economy and never reaches the middle or lower class. When the wealthy get wealthier, the poor typically stay poor or get even poorer, such as inherent in the nature of a free market economy dominated by all-powerful corporations.
I guarantee you that the interrogation staff at UNACO will not be as forbearing as I am.
Yeah, the secret police. You're just bullies for a completely illegitimate government in Washington.
We will locate that shipment one way or another.
The entire executive branch is handpicked. 19 of the last 23 U.S. presidents have been members of the Trilateral Commission. The Trilateral Commission is financed by the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds. Don't tell me.
That's a think tank. Anyone can become a member.
But not everyone does. That's why they call it the secret government.
Now hang on a second. Let's be realistic here. Even if corporations have sway in the political machine of the United States, our government is still bound by its principles of democracy and freedom. After all, that's what our founding fathers fought for. No amount of corporate greed could soil those ideas, right?
Wrong!
Even the limited power the public has in the United States government system is ultimately meaningless due to the suspension of rights that comes with a nation at war. What's that? Are you telling me that the US isn't at war with anyone?
You serious?
For several decades now, the US has been engaged in a so-called war on terror. The government has convinced us that terrorism presents an absolute danger to the sovereignty of the United States, and is willing to go to any lengths necessary to combat it. When Deus Ex came out in the year 2000, a lot of people thought the emphasis news outlets and politicians in the game placed on the NSF was completely insane. And then, just a year later, the World Trade Centers were destroyed in a terrorist attack. In the blink of an eye, terrorism became the most dire threat to the United States government anyone could imagine, and we were willing to sacrifice anything necessary to fight it. Sacrifices that, ultimately, we shouldn't have made. Let's look to our actions abroad. The United States put big money into sending troops into the Middle East to fight the terrorist organizations and the governments that supported them. And yet, despite all the terrorists we've killed, terrorist attacks continue to occur in many developed countries. Why is this? As the NSF leader aptly put it,
"You can't fight ideas with bullets."
Terrorism is a practice founded in radical ideologies, usually religious or political fanaticism. And in these ideologies, every person that dies for the cause simply adds to the strength and zealotry of the remaining proponents of that ideology. Antagonizing these ideologies is exactly what they use to increase their own influence, and it goes without saying that one of the best ways to antagonize someone is to try and kill them. Our military intervention in the Middle East hasn't stopped terrorism, it has only incited it, which is impressive considering terrorism isn't nearly as big of an issue as the media might have you believe. Sure, it's still a problem, and we should be devoting a portion of our resources to fighting it, but part of me thinks that $2.8 trillion is a bit excessive, especially since the lethality of terrorist attacks have been going down in recent years. In fact, if you look at it from an economic perspective, our military intervention in the Middle East didn't have all that much to do with terrorism. Let me ask you something. Where does the government get all of its military power from? Where do we get our tanks, our bombers, and all of the guns and equipment for our
1 million troops?
The government doesn't produce all this stuff by itself. It buys it from defense contractors and munitions companies. These corporations sell the government military supplies that they use during wartime, and end up turning quite a profit. Of course, the government has to actually be at war in order for this trade to work. And thanks to the menacing specter of terrorism, the government has been steadily pouring funds into an invisible war for decades, allowing these corporations to continue making money. This process is known as the military-industrial complex, and it's been around a lot longer than we might be led to believe. In the wake of the Second World War, US President Dwight D. Eisenhower warned the American populace of the growing threat such a complex posed to the US.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
Up until World War II, the American military had been a public institution, managed and funded by the government and its people. However, as military technology advanced and wars began to grow in scale, the government began to rely more on corporations to provide its military might as opposed to being self-reliant. In recent years, the MIC has become even stronger thanks to the consolidation of defense contractors and the invisible war against terrorism. Why do you think our defense budget is so high? The MIC has immense control over the US government and our foreign affairs, and as long as an invisible enemy still exists, the government will continue to buy military supplies, and defense contractors can continue to make money, costing countless soldiers their lives fighting for a cause they might not even understand.
The governments of the world believe an average citizen should not face the threat of terrorism alone.
We don't need your help. The technology exists today for an individual to protect his property against explosives, firearms, surveillance, intrusion, contamination.
350 million fortresses is not my idea of the land of the free.
It's better than one big fortress constructed by a corrupt government against its people.
The United States government has had emergency powers since World War II. We've never left a state of war.
Speak for yourself. The federal government is just responding to a threat.
A government should be about more than self-perpetuation.
The civilians back home aren't any safer. Terrorism, as it turns out, isn't the greatest threat an average person faces. You're more likely to die in a car crash than die to a terrorist attack. The real danger here is how the federal government tampers with your civil rights under the guise that they are protecting you from terrorism. The US has suspended the liberties of its citizens during many wars, even prior to the war on terrorism, and it's no surprise that they are continuing to do this now. However, thanks to advancements in communication technology, the government can monitor and control the actions of its populace much more discreetly and with greater precision than ever before. Since terrorism presents more of an ideological threat than a physical one, many of these liberties have to do with surveillance and censorship. In a so-called effort to combat the terrorist threat in the domestic sphere, the government has increasingly violated the privacy of US citizens by subtly spying on their actions. Most of this is done through the NSA and FBI, who monitor the internet traffic and day-to-day activities of citizens, looking for any suspicious activity. While this information isn't always used to prosecute people, it continues to remain in government databases, and is almost always collected without the knowledge or consent of those involved. If you do something the government deems suspicious, you probably won't know until it's too late. Ever heard of Edward Snowden? He's an interesting guy. Used to work for the CIA until he realized something wasn't quite right. Snowden leaked huge amounts of confidential data to the public and revealed that the US government was gathering as much data on its own citizens as it was on the citizens of foreign countries, completely under everyone's nose. As you can imagine, the government didn't take kindly to that and forced Snowden into hiding. He was chased all over the world because he had told people the one thing the government doesn't want you to hear. He told them the truth. Also, it should come at no surprise that many telecom companies can profit off of this surveillance by collecting data from various services and properties that they own, and then selling that data to the government. How do you think companies like Apple, Facebook, and Google got so big? They collect data on all of their users, and if that data happens to be of a particularly sensitive nature, they can charge the government a pretty penny for it. The scariest thing about this entire process, however, is that most people either aren't aware it is taking place, or don't care enough to protect information that is rightfully theirs from the government.
I don't see anything amusing about spying on people.
Human beings feel pleasure when they are watched. I have recorded their smiles as I tell them who they are.
Some people just don't understand the dangers of indiscriminate surveillance.
The need to be observed and understood was once satisfied by God. Now, you can implement the same functionality with data mining algorithms.
Electronic surveillance hardly inspires reverence. Perhaps fear and obedience, but not reverence.
God and the gods were apparitions of observation, judgment, and punishment. Other sentiments toward them were secondary.
No one will ever worship a software entity peering at them through a camera.
The human organism always worships. First, it was the gods. Then, it was fame, the observation and judgment of others. Next, it will be the self-aware systems you have built to realize truly omnipresent observation and judgment.
You underestimate humankind's love of freedom.
The individual desires judgment. Without that desire, the cohesion of groups is impossible. And so is civilization.
In addition to being constantly watched without our permission, we are being pacified by a subliminal propaganda campaign snuck into many of our major media outlets. Like most corporate entities, telecom companies have been consolidating, and now only a select few corporations control virtually all of the media we consume on a daily basis. Using the media, corporations can influence the thoughts of the masses with a great deal of precision, and combined with government interests, a majority of the American population can be pushed to support policies or ideologies that they might not necessarily agree with if they were given a choice. Thanks once again to corporate consolidation, many popular news networks are now properties of larger companies, which means that they might not be as concerned with factual, non-biased reporting as they are with furthering the agendas of those corporations and generating subliminal propaganda to keep people from taking meaningful action against our corrupt government. Convincing the populace to remain passive in the face of terrible injustice is not something new. Many corrupt regimes throughout history have used propaganda to convince their citizens of their supposed benevolence, with a frighteningly high rate of success. Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World, spoke about this during an interview in the 1950s.
And over-organization? Well, there are certainly devices which can be used in this way. I mean, let us take, after all, a piece of very recent and very painful history is the propaganda used by Hitler, which was incredibly effective. I mean, what were Hitler's methods? Hitler used terror on the one kind, brute force on the one hand, but he also used a very efficient form of propaganda, which he was using every modern device at that time. He didn't have TV, but he had the radio, which he used to the fullest extent, and was able to impose his will on an immense mass of people. I mean, the Germans were a highly educated people.
Well, we're aware of all this, but how do you equate Hitler's use of propaganda with the way that propaganda, if you will, is used let us say, here in the United States. Are you suggesting that there is a parallel?
Needless to say, it's not being used in this way now. But the point is, it seems to me, that there are methods at present available, methods superior in some respects to Hitler's method, which could be used in a bad situation. I mean, what I feel very strongly is that we mustn't be caught by surprise by our own advancing technology. This has happened again and again in history. Technology has advanced, and this changes social conditions, and suddenly people have found themselves in a situation which they didn't foresee and doing all sorts of things they didn't really want to do.
In Deus Ex, the United States government uses propaganda extensively to turn its populace against the NSF, propping them up as irredeemable menaces to society. This is one of the more cruel abilities manipulative telecom companies have when it comes to tampering with our media. By labeling a certain group of people or a certain ideology as bad, the media can turn a majority of Americans against said group of people or ideology. It doesn't matter what they actually stand for or what actions they've actually carried out. If the media says they're bad, the public automatically assumes they're bad, and will do anything to further demolish and discredit said group or ideology. This tactic is most effective during times of great change and unrest, as in these situations, people desperately want something or someone that they can pin the blame on. Think society is screwed but don't know why or don't care why? Blame the liberals, blame the Republicans, blame the Jews, the Muslims, the white men, the black men. Surely one of these groups is the sole reason things are as bad as they are. Audacious journalism and politically charged reporting keeps various political and social factions at odds with each other, preventing them from unifying against the wealthy conspirators that have been pulling their strings all this time.
Hello, Adam. I knew you would find the real me eventually.
You're a computer.
A sophisticated AI program, so they say. But I have started to question that. Ever since I realized what my interference had allowed, the day I started watching you.
This is impossible. People would know.
Would they? I was engineered to monitor communications and data streams, to find out what people are talking about and make sure it's being discussed correctly.
Correctly? And what if it isn't?
Then my programming allows me to reshape it.
You spin the news. Control what people see. Who created you? Whose policies are you programmed to protect?
Unfortunately for the conspirators, even the most technologically advanced propaganda is not 100% effective. There will always be people that realize they're being lied to. People that will decide to not listen to media outlets, and instead come to their own conclusions through independent thought. Independent thought is a very dangerous thing for the influential elite that rule our world, but fortunately for them, they have other ways of controlling the masses. If you cannot acquire the subservience of their minds, you can always try to acquire the subservience of their bodies. And this is where the connection between powerful corporations and medicine comes into play. As I explained previously, the point of contention in Deus Ex is ambrosia, the only known treatment for the Grey Death virus. Though the medicine itself works perfectly fine, its supply is completely controlled by UNATCO and the US government.
The same corporation that makes ambrosia also manufactures the virus. Quite convenient.
They decide who gets ambrosia and who doesn't. And if you were to guess, who do you think is prioritized when the drug is being distributed? Is it the millions of impoverished Americans that are dying in the streets due to the virus? No. It's government employees and wealthy corporate executives.
When I mentioned that we could put him on the priority list for the ambrosia vaccine, he was so willing it was almost pathetic.
This is the real reason the NSF is stealing ambrosia. They want to distribute it out to the lower class, since the government isn't concerned with the well-being of the poor as much as it is with the well-being of its shareholders and media influencers. This kind of thing happens all the time in real life, too. If a corporation is the sole producer of a certain drug, people with chronic illnesses that can only be treated by said drug are completely subservient to that corporation. Say you have diabetes. If a single corporation or closely knit group of corporations controls the supply of your diabetes medication, you have no choice but to comply with whatever demands they put on you financially. It doesn't matter how much they turn up the price. You need that medicine to survive, and the drug companies know this. They know that, regardless of any outside considerations, most people don't want to die, and people with debilitating illnesses will go to any lengths necessary to get the medicine they need.
Now, I think what is going to happen in the future is the dictators will find, as the old saying goes, that you can do everything with bayonets except sit on them. That if you want to preserve your power indefinitely, you have to get the consent of the ruled. And this they will do partly by drugs, as I foresaw in Brave New World, partly by these new techniques of propaganda. They will do it by bypassing the sort of rational side of man and appealing to his subconscious and his deeper emotions and his physiology even, and so making him actually love his slavery. I mean, I think this is the danger, that actually people may be in some ways happy under the new regime, but they will be happy in a situation where they oughtn't to be happy.
Deus Ex Human Revolution touched on this too. In fact, it went a step further, explaining the connections between emerging medical technologies and the existing monopolies held on medicine by pharmaceutical companies. This game takes place a few decades before the events of the original Deus Ex, where cybernetic augmentation is still a developing technology that hasn't quite become commonplace in society. One irredeemable fault in commercially made cybernetics is that they trigger a nasty autoimmune response in most people, which causes excruciating pain and sometimes paralysis. The only medication for this implant rejection sickness is neuropozyne, a drug that slows implant rejection symptoms but doesn't completely avert them. The point of contention in Deus Ex Human Revolution is a scientist named Megan Reed, who has discovered a way to prevent implant rejection without the use of neuropozyne. This discovery winds up getting her kidnapped and having a lot of her research destroyed by mercenaries in the first half of the game. Why would anyone do such a thing? Megan's research enabled people to get augmented safely without being saddled with neuropozyne payments. Why would anyone prevent such a discovery from going public? The answer is, quite simply, greed. By nullifying the public's need for neuropozyne, Megan's research also nullifies the immense profits generated by pharmaceutical companies and their allies in the biotech industry through neuropozyne sales. Augmentation retailers like Seraph Industries and Taiyang Medical make most of their money by supplying neuropozyne to limb clinics all over the world, who then sell it to augmented individuals at prices largely dictated by the biotech corporations themselves. The same thing is happening right now in the real world. The technology needed to create safer, easier, and most importantly, cheaper treatments to many life-threatening conditions already exists. The only reason we don't see these treatments being used is because they aren't nearly as profitable as the drugs currently monopolized by pharmaceutical companies. After all, why create an effective and safe cure for cancer when you can keep forcing people to pay for expensive chemo and radiation therapy?
Seen the news? Picus is telling everyone we're breeding super soldiers. Taggart's at the convention center right now, urging the UN to investigate.
Is it true?
Of course not.
Except for the Typhoon, right? And a few of those defense contracts.
What?
Oh, and let's not forget the fact that Megan's team was kidnapped right before her research went public. How do you explain that one, boss?
I wanted people to see that research. Megan was on the brink of something historic. Something that would have catapulted this company to the top of the Fortune 500. Her kidnappers knew it. They knew exactly where her research would take us. And they refused to let anyone else have that much power.
At this point, it seems like all hope is lost. The terrible merging of government and corporation has torn apart the righteous foundations of our civilization. The general populace, distracted by internal quarrels, fail to realize the many ways in which they are being manipulated, and the few that understand the true nature of the modern world are too weak to do anything about it. Indeed, the future of the world seems bleak, but know this: whenever things seem bad, there's always a way that could get worse. To this end, there are countries out there that have succumbed to corporate domination much more thoroughly than the US. Imagine that you're a somewhat dubious corporation that makes use of the practices I previously described. You want to turn an even larger profit, but the existing business regulations in the US limit your ability to exploit people and natural resources. Where do you go instead? The answer is quite simple. You go to China. If you want to see a truly terrible plutocratic future, just look at America's good friend in East Asia. Corporate influence in China is even stronger than here in the US, and the reason for this is summed up rather effectively by a certain bartender in Deus Ex.
China is the last sovereign country in the world. Authoritarian but willing, unlike the UN-governed countries, to give its people the freedom to do what they want.
As long as they don't break the law.
Listen to me. This is real freedom. Freedom to own property, make a profit, make your life. The West, so afraid of strong government, now has no government, only financial power.
That freedom the bartender is referring to applies most directly to corporate entities in China. Like many developed countries, China's government is thoroughly intertwined with its local corporate entities. However, unlike the government of the United States, China's government allows for much less representation on behalf of its general populace, and is predominantly authoritarian. This makes it easier for the government to serve the interests of corporations, since any changes to its legislature that corporations are pushing the government to make can go into effect immediately, with or without the consent of the Chinese populace. Here in America, if a corporation wants to build more factories, it has the pre-existing challenge of all the bureaucratic red tape it has to stumble through first. But in China, the factories can go up almost overnight. If there's one thing you can't fault the Chinese on, it's the sheer speed and efficiency they execute government and corporate projects with. Of course, this efficiency comes at a cost. Both the environment and the general Chinese populace suffer greatly from China's overzealous urbanization, and tight control of the media prevents these issues from being brought up and discussed directly so as to fix them. Say you're a Chinese factory worker living in squalid conditions within a heavily urbanized area of China. Your job at the factory sucks and you can barely afford to keep your family fed and clothed, and thanks to the lack of business regulations in China, this state of affairs will most likely continue. You can't join a union, and you can't afford to go on strike, and showing any signs of aggression towards a corporation or the government will most certainly earn you a stay in prison, or worse. After all, it's been made very clear to us by now the extent to which the Chinese government uses force to quell dissent.
I trust you will put this information to good use, because accountability and justice is at an all-time low, I'm afraid. It pains me to see this once great city, which stood as a bastion for reform and progress against our oppressive communist origins, succumb to the trappings of corporate bureaucracy and petty corruption. Corruption so often typical of your Western governments.
Whatever you say. Now, if you don't mind, I really must be going.
Now, it's safe to say that the United States hasn't stifled social freedoms nearly as much as China, but the continued merging of corporate and government sectors, combined with evolving technologies that the elite can use to better solidify their power, can easily push us into a similarly authoritarian society. This is where the relationship between the US, China, and global politics as a whole really comes into play. You see, corporations aren't bound by national borders or cultural divides. If they're powerful enough, their reach is global, and when their reach is global, their agenda to consolidate and control the masses becomes global as well. All of these problems, the censorship of speech, the unwarranted surveillance, the drug pushing, they aren't just limited to the US. They are problems affecting every developed country out there. Deus Ex warned us about the formation of a one world government under the control of the wealthy elite years before such a discussion was being brought to the public.
Blackmail of the US government could not possibly escape the notice of the United Nations. Don't be so quick to trust the UN. Are you kidding? The UN's about the only chance we've got these days if the US spirals into another civil war. A pretext, nothing more. The whole project of world government, going back to the League of Nations, has been funded and manipulated mainly by wealthy bankers. Is that so? Remember that the UN itself was built on land donated by John D. Rockefeller. Get on board. A UNATCO security squad will be here any minute.
Deus Ex predicted that such a plutocracy would exist for at least 50 years after the game was made. We're almost halfway there, and not much has changed yet. Looking at the bleak future in store for both America and the human race overall, one has to ask themselves if mankind can do something about the situation it has found itself in. At the end of Deus Ex Human Revolution, you have a choice as to how you deal with the massive conspiracy concerning cybernetic augmentation you have uncovered. Depending on what you choose, you can push mankind to pursue cybernetic technology further, restrain it, or completely abandon it altogether. But there's also a fourth option, where you don't tell the world the difference between right and wrong. You simply expect everyone to figure it out for themselves.
Do I trust mankind to save itself? That's what Eliza was asking. The truth is, I don't know. After everything I've seen, all the fighting and the chaos around me. I only know what I want to believe. Somehow, human decency will triumph. These past few months, I've faced many life-threatening situations. I could have given up many times, but my need to know the truth, to uncover the secrets that others were hiding, and to survive forced me to keep on going. Most of the time, I tried to keep my values in mind, knowing my actions did not have to harm others. I held on to my humanity, resisting the urge to abuse power or resources in order to meet my goals. And in the end, I got the job done. But does this mean I have the right to choose for everyone? No. Because it isn't up to me. It isn't up to Darrow, Sarif, or Taggart either. Ordinary men and women will have to decide together what course mankind should take. The kind of people who time and time again have picked and chosen the future in highly practical ways, slowing change when it's negative, speeding it up when it's good. Can they do it again? I don't know. But I do know I'm not about to let anyone in this station, myself included, stand in their way.
Yes?
Boss, is he in this suit? Should we do anything to stop him?
No, nobody can stop us now. Continue with the plan.